en el Observatorio. Ahora los dejo con el profesor Burchell.
Thank you. Let me start over this side. And thank you very much for the invitation here today. It's very good to be able to talk about some of the work I've been doing very recently, but also some of the work I've been doing 10 years ago and bringing that up to date. And I very much look forward to your new work on work intensity to be kept informed. I'm also just going to say a little bit about Kirsten. She mentioned that she's going to the London School of Economics soon. What Kirsten didn't say, and it was announced publicly today, although Kirsten was known for a few weeks, the reason for this is because the British Academy has created some what they're calling global professorships to look at important world topics, and there are just 10 of these incredibly prestigious positions, and people getting these positions have come from all over the world, and Kirsten has got one of those positions, so congratulations, that's a fantastic news for you and for Chile too. And very, very well deserved too, I must say.
Thank you for the reference you wrote.
All right, let me. So it's a great pleasure to be here today, and the organisers tell me there is a very prestigious audience with lots of different angles on so I hope what I'm going to be talking about is of interest both to the academics here and also for the practitioners, the employers and trade unions and so on. Let me start out by saying exactly what I mean by work intensity, because it's a very specific meaning that I've got here. I spoke on Tuesday a lot about working hours, long working hours, and we know that's a problem. Again, working long hours is one of the very key important indicators in Kirsten's measures of job quality. I'm looking at something else, how much work you do within each hour. The amount of physical input or mental input into your work. And you'll see why this is important through my presentation. We'll see, my slides moving on themselves. So I'll show you why it's important, what the data is, what the evidence is that we've had changes in work intensity over that time. I'll be looking a little bit about trying to understand, and this was a big puzzle for a long time, to understand what it is that's been causing changes in the intensity of work in Europe. And in particular, I want to talk about the role of technology, partly because, as you'll see, I'm claiming it's very key, but also because I think we're going to experience even bigger technological changes in the coming 15 years. So it's going to be very important to think about how those are going to affect the quality of our working lives. So, okay. So first of all, how do we measure work intensity? One very simple way, and this is something I did myself, we can just ask people to compare their intensity of work, it could be the speed of work or the amount of effort they're putting into their work, in their job now compared to the job they were doing 5 years ago, whether it's the same job or a different job. And if you do that, when I've done it and other people have asked the same question and got the same very similar responses, you get about a third of people say there's been no change. Only a very small number, about 5%, 1 in 20, say they're actually working less hard now than they were 5 years ago. But 2/3 of the population of employees say that they're working harder now than they were 5 years ago. Now, you might take that as evidence of an increase in the intensity of work, but I'm sure to an audience with many psychologists here, they would immediately point out there's lots of other ways that we could account for that data. In particular, it's actually very difficult to remember how hard we were working 5 years ago. I can think of all the problems I have in work now, all the things that are causing me to work hard now. I find it very difficult to think equally about what I was doing 5 years ago. So I think we can pretty much disregard that evidence. It's interesting that everybody thinks they're working harder now than 5 years ago, but in terms of an actual change, I don't think so. So, what else can we do to measure it? Some people, particularly economists, immediately think, well, let's measure productivity. If we can measure output, the more output people are producing, it must be because they're working harder. So increases in productivity mean increases in work intensity. Again, I think there's no evidence to suggest these two things are linked. There's this bumper sticker which I'm giving you there. Of course I don't look busy, I did it right the first time. And we probably know in our own organisations, many people who are most productive never look busy, never look like they're in a hurry. Putting it another way, more formally, productivity is brought about by many things. Work intensity might be one of them, but also, probably more importantly, to get a productive workforce, you have to have a highly trained workforce, high human capital, and you have to have the right tools, the right equipment, the right computers, the right whatever. And so, if people don't have the right training or the right tools, they could be working very intensely, but without great productivity. In fact, and I think Google have been one of the people who have claimed this in the past, that if you get people working too intensely, they don't have time to think about the bigger picture. And if their job involves any creativity, thinking about how things should be, if they're so busy all the time, they're not going to be able to think towards the future. So what I think of is the only viable way of actually measuring across a large level, a country level or a continent level across Europe, is we need a repeated cross-sectional data, very good quality data where we ask exactly the same question on a regular basis and see how people's responses change over time. And fortunately, and this is the European Working Conditions Survey, the survey that Kirsten referred to in her talk, that now has been done in Europe since the year 1990 and has now expanded to include other countries outside of Europe too. We do have very good long-term data when people answer these two specific questions. And again, this has been so valuable, these questions that have been included in every way, that we're going to be asking them again just 2 weeks ago. I was in Brussels. We're planning the 2020 survey that will include these two questions. So they are, to what extent your job involves working at high speed or working to tight deadlines. And we can see on the next slide, you can see the Spanish version of these questions, because of course in the European Working Conditions Survey we have to translate these questions into languages for every European country. I think it's over 40 languages we now have translated the question. And there you are, you can take just a little bit of time to look at how that's asked in the Spanish version. I think, from my understanding, my very limited understanding of Spanish, it's a very good translation. It's quite an exact translation. In other languages, it's more difficult to translate exactly. For instance, in the French version, they talk about cadence rather than vitesse or speed of work. So, always difficult whenever you do international surveys, but I think this one, we've got it quite well. So let's then, on the next slide, we can see the data we've got here, and let me come and start pointing out things on the graph, because that's the easier thing to do. So here we have, and this is data only from when I was studying it before, up to the year 2005, but it's a different era, you'll see later. So this shows the first 4 waves of the European Working Conditions Survey, and we've got separate lines here for those 2 questions, working to tight deadlines and working at high speeds. And in the green we've got the men, and the blue lines are for the women. And you see, whichever measure we're using, a very clear, statistically significant increase in work intensity over that period of time. So, and on the next slide, you can see this is another way that this is now not my own, the last one was my own data, this is now official EU data. What they've done is added those 2 scales together to look at, if you like, the percentage of time people are working at high intensity. So if people say they're always working to high speed, always working to tight deadlines, they're scoring 100, down to 0 means never working at high speed, never working to tight deadlines. And then if we look at the results on the next slide for that, and if we look at the, I hope you can see down the bottom here, the EU 15, and different colours are going through the different years, And we've got this, again, using this, the same as I showed you before. Every year, it's been measured, up to 2005, there's been an increase in work intensity. And I find that to be very convincing evidence. I can't think of any other explanation for that data except to think we really are working more intensively over time. We can see on the next slide why it's important. And of course, employers looking at this might say, well, isn't that a good thing? Isn't this means my employees are working harder? When we look at, and I'm just going to show one slide looking at the relationship between this work intensity and well-being. I'm just picking out, when we ask people whether their job gives them headaches or not, and you can see here, the people who say that they never work at high speed, about 10% of them, and roughly equal for men and women, say that they get headaches. If you go to the other end of the graph, people who say they're working at high speed all of the time, for men about 20% now getting headaches, and for women it's almost 30%. A doubling or trebling of the rate of headaches for men and for women. You get pretty much the same sort of levels of increase across a whole number of other measures. We've got about 10 different measures of people's well-being at work, but particularly the ones you'd expect to respond to this, such as the stress-related things, but also the musculoskeletal things, people having aching bodies, bad backs. We get the same doubling and trebling of their reported illnesses. I know, of course, this isn't conclusive evidence, but I think this is, again, very strong evidence. We ask them about their headaches and about their work intensity in completely different parts of the questionnaire. We're not asking them to decide whether it's the work intensity gives them the headache, but we get this strong relationship. And again, just when I think of the other aspects of job quality, like people's job security, or their wages, or the hours they're working, again, you get relationships to their illness measures, such as headaches. But this is stronger than any of those other job quality measures we've got. Doubling or trebling the rates of illness from work, that's a huge effect and something we should be very worried about. Also notice, and I think this again, it wasn't at all obvious before I started this work, and this was a big shock to me. I must say, I didn't expect this, but I checked it again and again, looking at different aspects, different parts of the workforce. You continually get this really quite, I think, extreme reaction to the intensity of work. Also notice, I expected that we wouldn't get any gradient at the lower levels. Maybe even people would be bored in these jobs, but then you'd only start to get more medical problems increasing as people start to work at the very intense levels. Again, it's clearly not the case. We've got a very, again, across other measured illness as well, a linear increase. Every time there's an increase in the intensity of work, you're getting more work-related illnesses. So, not surprisingly then, and as the results from this sort of research came out, there were lots of people writing about work-related stress, particularly about intensity of work, how the overwork culture. We had lots of books. You could go to any airport, any station in the UK, you'd see a row of books about stress about work, how everything in the world is getting faster, we're expected to work faster, we're getting more stressed, lots of self-help books telling people how to manage their own stress. And even during that time, as you saw, there was an increase in work intensity. So if we look at the next slide then, and let me just talk a bit about what it is that's been driving that. And these are some of these are, we've got some evidence for, some of these are very speculative, but let me go through just, I'm not going to dwell in great length. What we do notice, there's been different things in Europe driving how hard people work. At the beginning of this period, if you go back to 1990, people were often saying it was their boss made them work faster, or the machines they were working with, the assembly line, was what drove them to having to work faster. Towards the end of that period, people's peers, your own colleagues, became much more important in driving the speed of work, and customers too. But the main thing was this pressure, real or imaginary, from your own peers, the team you were working with, not wanting to let colleagues down. Trade unions, of course, have always had an interest in managing their workload. say, again, in traditional Fordist production lines, the trade union would very carefully monitor the speed of the conveyor belt as a way of monitoring work intensity. In Europe, we've seen the decline of trade unions, and that may well have allowed this increase in work intensity. Management, I think, without a doubt, are more efficient now than they used to be, with much better trained, better educated managers. And if you look at historical accounts of people at work, they spent a lot of time without work to do, not because they didn't want to work, but because their machines were broken, or they didn't have the raw materials, or because they didn't have any orders to fulfill. And management are much better now, producing a continuous flow of work, which is good in many ways for efficiency, but not good for work intensity. I'm going to come back to look at the effect of computers and IT, because that's a complex relationship, and I hope Google might have something to say about that later. Maybe there's other things as well. Maybe globalization and global competition. People have been looking. I can't find any evidence for this being true, but it's plausible. Maybe it's just what capitalism does. Maybe we should be blaming capitalism for all these things. Certainly in the UK, shareholder pressure, always trying to drive up the price of the shares, and one of the easiest ways to increase the price of your shares is to make some of the workforce redundant, to reduce costs. So, of course, everybody who stays behind is going to have to work harder. Maybe it's because of greater inequality. Now there's more, as societies across Europe, almost all of the European countries have become more unequal, which gives you more incentive to get promotions, to get to the top of the pyramid, because it's such a steep pyramid now. In the public sector, particularly in the UK, increasingly we're expecting much higher quality hospitals and schools, but with lower tax. And if you have public sector with low tax and high expectations, that's at the cost of work intensity. And maybe a final thing, and I shouldn't be too negative, I'm starting to sound very negative, aren't I? One of the reasons I think why people are working harder is because they enjoy their jobs more. I think, possibly, again, I don't have any evidence for this at all, but you can see here's an advert for SAP, an IT company, and in their advert, they say they're looking for people not who want to listen to music in their spare time or play golf in their spare time, but in their spare time they want to build things like modular, standards-based, integrated applications platforms. I hope the translators managed to translate that. I don't understand it. But there you are, creating jobs, particularly many white-collar jobs, where people aren't being forced to work intensely, but they feel such a commitment to their job or get such pleasure from their job. They themselves are the worst person for exploiting their own labour. So there you are, I've given you a global picture. Here's the same graph as I showed you 10 minutes ago. And if you look more closely, you'll notice that there's one country, the UK, which actually bucks the trend. We saw a huge increase in work intensity between 1990 and 1995. But after that, in the UK, we've had a decline over a 10-year period in work intensity. And actually, and I'll show you some graphs later, that stayed at that lower level. Something different was going on in the UK to all those other countries, and that's something that I set out to try and find out. And I'll say that wasn't easy. I went through all of that list of possible explanations and couldn't find any of them that would fit, that would make me understand why it was different, why the UK had such a tremendous increase in work intensity, and then this continual decline. I found at least part of the answer, and let me show you that. So this is where we're getting into the role of technology. So here you are, this is again the same data, but just to make it clearer for you on a bigger scale, and perhaps I can come here. So here we've got the same time scale, 1990 through to 2005. This is the EU data for the EU 12 countries. I'm restricting it to the smaller group of the original EU countries. All the new entries complicate things a bit. And here's the UK, this bigger increase at the beginning, and then this reduction, long-term reduction, decline in work intensity. What's different between the two? In the next slide, you can see the one variable that I think is key to it, and it's this question. It's the last question I expected, but by the time I got to looking at this, I was getting desperate to try and find something that would explain it. The question that, again, it's a question that we asked in every single wave of the European Working Conditions Survey, and we asked people whether their main job involved working with computers, personal computers, networks, mainframes, and so on. And again, it was on this scale, the same scale from all of the time through to never. It's not a perfect question. Increasingly, we're aware much more now than then that many of us, although if we're not working with a keyboard, still computers can be very centrally involved in the work we do. For instance, with hidden computers, computers controlling the rate of flow. So it's not a perfect question, but let's see how this changes over time. And you can see here again we're comparing the UK in the rate of people using computers at least half of the time. And the UK, throughout this period, was way ahead of other European countries in terms of our use of computers. We were about 10 or 15 years, probably about 10 years ahead of the rest of the EU. And maybe I would suggest if there's a reason for this, it was because our much closer relationship with the United States, which again was ahead of us, of driving much of this change. In the next graph then you'll be able to see why this was important, because, and it's getting more complicated, but I'll if we break down the work intensity rates for those people who are high, medium or low IT users, people are using it pretty much all the time, some of the time or very little of the time, then we start to get very different patterns. And again, I've broken this down separately by men and women. And here again, this is going back to our work intensity, the percentage of people working at high intensity. You can see these two lines are the only two lines that are really showing quite this dramatic increase in this early period of time. And these are the men and the women working with computers most or all of the time. Once you take them out of the data set, there's very little change in the rest of the lines. But not only does it go up dramatically for that group in this first time, it went down dramatically in that second period. Again, the others didn't show that drop, they didn't show the increase. So something was peculiar about the people using IT. If we look at the next graph, again, just a simplification of this graph, comparing, looking also at the European Union, we didn't get this spike with the high IT users in the EU. It was just in the UK. It was a UK-specific phenomenon of this, this one group of the IT workers that we had this spike. So, what caused it? Something changed, I think, in 1995 regarding IT. And I don't know if anyone would like to guess what it was. Probably only about a quarter of the audience can remember 1995. But do you remember Windows 95? I think, to my mind, my memory of IT is that with Windows 95, it was the first time we had a really stable platform that we understood, that plug and play. It didn't take you 2 or 3 days to connect a printer to your computer and get it to work. You understood the operating system. All of the computers had the same operating system. So it could be, I don't know, maybe it's too good, too neat to be true, but I think something definitely changed in the pre-1995 and the post-95 eras. And let me talk you through what I think was different about those two eras in terms of the use of technology. Again, if we go on to look at the... There were lots of things that were different, I think, that made using IT much more stressful before about 1995. And I'm going to break it down into 3 different things. It was to do with the way that people were trained to use that through their education. It was the nature of the machines themselves they had to use, and the way that management set up the systems and procured the systems and provided the systems. So if we go through those 3. First of all, if we look back to ways that computers were taught in schools in the UK and in Europe in, say, the 1980s, there was an aspiration that computers should be in schools. but they weren't being used for any of the skills that were transferable to the workplace. People were sometimes learning mathematics through computers, particularly geometry. They had computers that could draw squares and circles and so on. Some of the more advanced pupils were learning to program. They were programming in Fortran and the other languages that were common at the time. But they certainly weren't using PowerPoints. They weren't learning how to use Word or any of the modern productivity tools. So very little transferability of IT skills from education or training into the workplace. Secondly, in terms of the early personal computers, again, some of you may, and it gives me nightmares when I think back, I wrote my PhD on one of those machines and it crashed every day. The storage was so unreliable, I had to keep multiple copies of everything. All of these different systems, the BBC system, the Alan Sinclair system, the early Apple system, they all had different operating systems. It was almost impossible to transfer between them without going through training. Their user interfaces, non-graphic, were very difficult to understand. So, and these were, until Windows 95 came along and standardised all of these things, working between these systems was very difficult. And then finally, just in thinking about the way that they were bought by managers, the managers buying these systems and bringing them into the workplace had very little understanding of what would work in the workplace. They were guessing, they were often buying machines which then became obsolete within months of them being purchased. This was actually, I think, almost exactly the same, the first portable computer I had in my work. It weighed about 15 kilos. This woman must be a professional weightlifter to be able to carry it. You couldn't carry this around. The idea of taking this on the train or taking it home, it had no battery in it, you couldn't use it away from the mains. Managers had even less idea often of how to provide and train their workforce to use these machines. So I think that is what caused that increase in work intensity among that IT group. It was having the wrong technology, it was unstable technology, and it was procured badly, they didn't know how to use it. But things changed, and again, if you read back at that time, you can see this antagonism. We had people who were very well trained to use typewriters. They hated it when the managers brought in word processors. They used to wait for the manager to go home at lunchtime, and they would get their typewriter out to type their letters. They were so much easier and quicker using a reliable typewriter rather than an unreliable computer. Right, let me now move forward 10 or 15 years and think about bringing some of this research up to date in terms of some of my more recent thinking. And one of the things that, and this is exactly the same thing Kirsten was talking about before, is we now have a standardised across the EU the way that we talk about job quality. And so we've got these 7 different aspects of job quality which are measured by the most recent versions of the European Working Conditions Survey. We look at people's social environment, being respected, not being bullied, their physical environment, not having to lift heavy weights or being in a dangerous or unpleasant environment. Being able to use discretion and skills at work, having security and prospects for the future, earnings of course, working time quality, not working long hours, not working unpredictable hours, but then we've got work intensity as well. And you'll notice here our definition of work intensity is broadened out. So we not only contain those same questions that I used before about tight deadlines and high speed, but we're looking at the determinants of pace, and probably most importantly, we've added in the emotional demands that people have at work as part of work intensity, thinking that many health workers in particular, the things that they would describe as intense and difficult in their work, isn't so much the speed of work, but always having to care for the emotions of other people. And you can see on the next slide, here we have a detailed breakdown of the components of that. So we've got what we call the quantitative demands. Here, I don't know if you can read this at the back, but I'll talk you through it. The quantitative demands on people, on their intensity, and this is working high speeds, tight deadlines, and other questions like not having enough time to get the job done. Things that drive the pace of your work, such as again, your boss, your colleagues, and so on. And then we've got the emotional demands on your work, having to hide your feelings from the people you're working with, having to deal with care for other people, having to deal with angry clients and so on. Being in situations that are emotionally disturbing. So now we have this much broader definition of work intensity. Again, I haven't got a slide to show it, but when you look at the relationship between these measures of work intensity and their well-being measures, I mean, much better developed measures of people's physical health and their emotional health, their well-being, their ability to enjoy their day-to-day activities, not to have symptoms of depression, to feel relaxed, to sleep well, to look forward to doing things tomorrow. All of those emotional well-being measures, again, very strongly linked to these work intensity measures, more so than the other job quality measures. There's also some columns here which you almost certainly can't read, and this is the average of these things from 2005, 2010 and 2015. I couldn't show you these for the earlier period I was looking at because we didn't measure most of them then. We've only been developing these measures here. But if you could read all these numbers, you've noticed that they hardly change over that period of time. During this period, we've had a period of remarkable stability in work intensity. Now that comes as a surprise to me because, of course, if you don't have good survey evidence on these things, you have to rely on what the journalists are telling you about people at work and the social theorists are telling us about the way the world is changing in a global sense. And at the time, as we went through that big recession, both going into it and out of it, there were a huge number of stories in the press and qualitative researchers describing how people were having to work more intensively during this time. But actually the reality is that work intensity in Europe seemed to have peaked around 2005 and has been very level since then. It hasn't gone up, it hasn't gone down. Again, you might have expected going into the recession it will go down, but no, it's very much on the level. And maybe that's good news, maybe it's bad news, because actually if we look at many other measures of job quality through this period of time, those other measures, we've seen, if anything, gradual improvements. Not in skills and discretion, but most of those other measures have improved very slightly. So we're not seeing improvements, but at least we're seeing stability. I'm going to end very soon, but just to give you, there are individual differences. Again, I haven't paid much attention to them. It's the young and middle-aged workers who are working most intensively. Older workers, for whatever reason, aren't put under that same strain at work. Demanding colleagues have been going up there again. If you are, in many cases, what the main thing driving people is that imagined sense of not wanting to let down colleagues and customers. And again, one thing that's gone up in this time is the emotional demands on people at work, particularly workers in health and also hospitality. Hospitality is the other area where we get this very high emotional demands on individuals. Let me just think about what I think is going to happen in the future. And of course I'm not going to predict the future because whenever economists or any other social scientists predict the future, they always make complete fools of themselves. If you look back at all the predictions that were made of the future back in the 1960s and 70s, I don't know any of them that were at all accurate. But on the next slide, I think I can see, again, thinking about the technological revolutions which I think are very likely to happen in the next 10 or 15, 20 years. We've already seen, we know, very big advances in autonomous vehicles, cars that can drive themselves, something we all thought would be impossible 10 years ago. Now I think we're fairly confident that that technology is to a point where it's clearly cars can drive better than, cars driven by computers are better than cars driven by humans in terms of their safety record. We've still got legal problems to sort out. There's all sorts of other ways in which we're seeing this surprisingly very rapid technological changes. And this is to do, of course, with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And now we're getting to a phase where machines are not being taught by the people operating them, but machines have got algorithms where they can teach themselves. And it's under those circumstances that you can get these incredibly rapid advances in technology, advances that can take place in hours rather than, as traditionally was the case, in decades. what's this going to do to work intensity in the future? I think it could well be it's those same variables that were driving what made a lot of people's lives a misery in the UK. We're using technology back in the early 90s. It's going to be those same variables. Is the workforce of the future going to be educated to work alongside this artificial intelligence and robotic technology? Is that technology going to be stable enough that we'll be able to trust it, that it will be amenable to working with us, the human interface with those machines? Is that going to be something that improves or our working lives or makes things difficult for us? And how is it going to be managed? Do our current managers have the skills to integrate these future technologies into our working lives in a way that understands their workforce and understands their technology? I'll leave you to think about those three questions. And I think I've probably got one more slide that I want to show you. No, I've said enough. I'll leave it there. I've said enough. Whether one of the reasons we like to say that we're working intensively is because it makes us feel like more important people is a whole other question, which we can come back to if you like. But let me leave it there. And so there you are. Maybe, and this is why again, Google, maybe you're going to reassure us that all these things are in hand and we should look forward to a less intensive, less stressful work with new technologies. Or maybe we should be worried. But in terms of one aspect of job quality that we really ought to be thinking more than others, I think work intensity is that one most important job quality measure in terms of people's psychological well-being. Yeah, thank you.